And I'm jumping now, I'm going to jump completely out of this and I'm going to jump into government. And this is where this is going to get a lot more fun, I hope. Because this is where the action is of change. And so I'm going to start, as we come back into the next section, with Alaska, the government I know the most, and talk about how you build a government, because I got to do it in terms of seeing it happen. On the tribal level, then I'm going to go there where I got to do it with really great tribal people, help them build their government. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about homelessness, because in my world here in Alaska, it's mostly Native Americans, and I want to talk about it in a broader sense of history and what's happening here. And then leadership, I'm going to talk quickly on that. And then I'm going to talk about American government. I've already disclosed a lot of what's in there, so I won't have to repeat myself. So that'll go fairly quickly. And then I'm going to talk about the emerging China and Russia and what's happening there. And then we still have a bit to go, but that'll take us up to page 31. I got 37 pages of notes, so we're getting closer. We got a ways to go. I know people are getting tired, but remember, this feed is going to be a constant feed. Whatever glitches has been, the guys here have been laying down a separate track, so they're going to clean that all up, and so we're going to get this reloaded into the internet clean. Now, we're already in our second reel, because we burned up 10 hours, and they won't let us do more than that on YouTube on one program, so now we're on program 2. We're working into the next 10 hours. I really am trying to get it done, too, in this next 10 hours. My team's getting tired, but I'm not. We have a lot to say. We have a lot to do, and this is just the beginning of the next 50 years and closing out 50. So we got a ways to go tonight, and we're going to take a little break. We'll be back shortly. Okay, we're back. I know that was a shorter break, and we're trying to keep them shorter and keep things moving. The next area I want to talk about is Alaska, and this is, again, kind of the big issue for me, at least in terms of my life and history. When my dad got here in the mid-50s, it was a really different place. The average age of Native Americans here was less than 40. So people had seen a lot of death by then. My dad was excited about arriving, and kind of the way he got here, he had been active in the Democratic Party in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, on the Iron Range, in a small town called Eveleth. And there he had met Hubert Humphrey when he was running his first time for the U.S. Senate. And in that race, they became friends, and Dad was just a really strong worker. And so Humphrey encouraged my dad to go to Alaska. There were a lot of opportunities here, and a young person would have a lot more opportunity here than Minnesota. And Humphrey helped my dad get a job as an inspector on a federal project here in Alaska. And that lasted about 6 months. When my dad did get here, he didn't really care for that kind of work. He wanted to be in education. He was educated as a teacher. But it was so different. He ended up, of course, teaching school, and then he ended up teaching at night too at the university. And his area and his specialty was Russian history. And of course, Alaska has a lot of Russian history because we were, in fact, a Russian colony at one point. And I want to talk about sort of the pre-statehood conditions, because that's where my dad arrived here. We weren't a state yet, it was still a territory. We came up the Elkhorn Highway, which was built predominantly by black soldiers during the World War II. And it was a horrible assignment to be cutting a road through the middle of nowhere. But it was a way in which supply lines were being fortified to move things into Russia, and then on from there into the Eastern Front. And so this Alaska all of a sudden strategically became important, and if you look at where we're situated in the world, you'll understand that importance even more if you look at a globe. And one of the callers I had on a national radio show the other day brought it up, the Arctic. And this is well known here, what we've got going, and there's a lot of reasons the Arctic is well positioned. If you think about where Europe is, Asia is, and the Americas, this is kind of the hub, Alaska. And so FedEx and UPS both organized their international hubs for the Northern Hemisphere here in Alaska. UPS has Fairbanks Airport, and Federal Express has Anchorage. And they're building in Anchorage a 700,000 square foot warehouse. And they're going to be doing a lot more of that in Anchorage and in Fairbanks to support international traffic over the Northern Hemisphere as trade moves between these three primary continents. All the air traffic used to run through Anchorage when Soviet air traffic was restricted. So we used to have daily and even twice daily flights refueling in Anchorage, taking us into Europe. We could be in Europe 9 hours, 10 hours, any European city every day of the week, because every major airlines came through Anchorage. When they opened Russian airspace, Soviet airspace, all of that then changed because more direct routes became possible. But still, Anchorage and Fairbanks, because of the situation, are some of the busiest cargo routes in the world, actually. Most people don't know that because, again, we have small population. But think about proximity. And I've talked about the size of Alaska at other times, but think about this. It's about 18%, almost a fifth of the entire land mass of the United States. This state, from where I'm sitting here to the tip of the Aleutian Islands, almost touches Japan and Russia. It's about 15, 18, almost 2,000 miles across all the way down. And then you look at, from where I'm sitting going the other direction, towards the east, and you're talking about almost 1,500 miles, almost all the way to Seattle when you look at the panhandle of Alaska, as they call it. And then if you look north from where I am, to get to the top of my state, it's 700 miles. You know, that's like from New York to Washington, D.C. is only 225, you know, so just to get some perspective again. And that's just within my own state. You know, you only get a third of the way from there. You could cut Alaska into, or cut Alaska in half, and then Texas would be the third largest state. The north of the state, above the Brooks Range, is the size of Montana. 8,000 people live there. It's an entire oil basin. Oil, coal, unbelievable resources on the North Slope all the way out into the Arctic Ocean. That whole area is strategic. We'll talk more about it later. But Alaska, when we were bought from Russia, it was kind of a weird transaction. We negotiated what they called the Treaty of Secession, where they gave up any claim to Alaska in exchange for 2 cents an acre and that was 1865, right after the Civil War was ending. And we paid $7 million for the whole place. I mean, what a deal. And I talked about the landmass, the coastal area of Alaska, because the way it's situated with all those islands and all the areas that stretch out. The coastal area of Alaska, now federal waters are 200 miles out, so that's a big distance, you know. Alaska is bigger around the coast than the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast of the rest of the United States combined. Not separately, combined. Take it all, combine it, we're still a bigger coastline. And that translates into 200 miles worth of resources. The state boundary is the first 3 miles. That's what states have. After that, it's federal jurisdiction for 200. That changed during the 70s. It used to be a closer limit. It was during my dad's time in Congress that limit extended 200 miles. And it was driven a lot by the arguments in Alaska, because our fisheries were being plundered by the fleets of Asia and Europe, who were just plundering the fisheries here on the high seas. They still are. And that was a big part of what was happening then, was protecting the fisheries, the food supplies, which go back to Alaska's early days even. And we'll talk about that as I get to that stage of our history. But after the Treaty of Secession, the Russians gave it up. They figured the way we were coming across the West, we were going to take it anyway sooner or later. They might as well give it up. And they needed the money. The Tsar needed the money. So that's how that happened. They gave it up. They thought it was all fished out, furred out. They were basically involved in the fur trade. And they had wiped out a few species even along the way. But they were basically taking the fur from here. They were trading then in Hawaii for things, and they were headed to China, and they traded the fur there for opium, and they did the big route. It was an opium and fur trading route, among other things. But these were the big trade routes of that time, of the 1700s and 1800s. When we got it, they thought it was all over with. And then they discovered both copper and gold and precious metals in Alaska, and of course, everybody knows about the Alaska Gold Rush of 1898. In that, one of the big ones was copper, and the Guggenheim and Morgan Trust. You remember the Morgan Banking Trust? They show up a lot in our history. And the Guggenheims were an interesting group. They were Jewish folks that had immigrated to the United States, and they came here in the 1800s, and they sold what they called stovepipe polish. It's what you would use on the stovepipes coming off a wood stove to keep them black. And then from there, they made it out to Colorado during the silver rushes and the gold rushes that were going on in the West. And they ended up getting involved heavily in silver and copper. And then when things began to happen in Alaska, they came to Alaska and they cornered the copper market basically for World War I and then later for World War II. This is a big deal because a lot of copper gets used in a lot of bullets and brass. You know, that's all copper. And so what happened with the Guggenheims and Morgans when they came to Alaska, there were no people here hardly at all. So they had to produce hay for horses and food for people and bring people here. And eggs during the gold rush were $1 each. That was, put that in your head, gold was only $20 an ounce. Gold right now is about $1,700 an ounce, almost $1,800 an ounce today. So in perspective, you know, I mean, certain things were really pricey because they weren't available and other things were a different deal. So here's no people. They discover copper in Kennecott. So rich they couldn't believe it. You know, in fact, how it went is they had to build a railroad to get to it through the most treacherous places on earth. And they did, and they pulled out what today would be billions of dollars, the highest grade copper. The first train load, which was stockpiled before the rail arrived, the first rail load out paid for the whole works. That's what they had found. There's a hole there. They ran a television thing for years. The guy that owned that mine, the next year after the series ended, they got their guy in and he rappelled down into an 800-foot cavern taller than the Empire State Building that was hollowed out, where they took out chalcocite ore that was like 70% copper straight out of the ground and hauled it off. So the Guggenheims had made a gazillion dollars. Why did they leave here? Well, for all the reasons I mentioned, but while they were here, they cornered the timber and the fish, and what they did with the fish, they just netted the whole river. They just stopped everything when the migrating species came out, and they starved out everybody up the river. They were dying in these villages. They took everything. These canneries took it all. And they shipped it south to Seattle. They shipped the ore to Seattle. They cut all the timber they could. They shipped it all out of here. And they were destroying everything along the way. Well, then they discovered copper in Chile and Peru. And there was a lot of labor there. There were a lot of indigenous people, and they were cheap, and they had their own housing and grew their own food, so you didn't even have to provide much for them. So off they went. And you know what they did is they pulled up all the railroad track with them, so nobody in that mining district would ever do a thing again. And I own, with partners, the second most important deposit in that I acquired a number of years ago, and have quietly been doing some work out there. We've got the Elliott Hubbard mine, which is the same type of ore, just on the other end of the mineral belt. But now it's within a giant park and preserve, and we're going to talk about that as we get into this conversation about Alaska. Because this is a place where it kind of got played out more or less in a couple of generations, not 250 years, but in the last 100 or so, in terms of what's going on in the modern time. So gold, copper, timber, fish, that was the first kind of grab and go. And then we got into the Depression period where everything kind of slowed down. There were still a bunch of old independent gold miners. They were still running around. There were still people trying to make a living. And then we had World War II start. And now this was over, because here's what we did. Unlike the Canadians, what we did is we said all non-essential industries are over. So the entire gold mining industry ended. All of it ended. The only thing that could be mined were strategically important metals. And so most of what was happening in Alaska was scrapping out all the metal that had ever come in here and shipping it out to get put into the war effort. Mining stopped for all practical purposes here. And then gold, of course, after, during the Roosevelt period, was frozen at $35 an ounce. And then after the war, everything had quadrupled in price, labor, materials, everything. So it wasn't economic to restart the engines. and reinvigorate these properties and these mines. So they just died. The whole industry kind of faded away and went away. In Canada, they did the opposite. They subsidized their industry a little bit, and they kept it alive. And today in the world, and Australia did something similar. Today in the world, the most aggressive, what they call junior mining companies, are the British Columbian, the Canadian companies, and the Australians. And it's because they kept it alive. We let it all die. Here in Alaska, everyone doing anything up here of any size is from somewhere else. They're not from the United States. Our biggest trading partners are Asia. China just left here. They'd like to have the whole place. They're working really hard on it. They got a few friends here that are working with them because they like the money, and they're greedy bastards. They really are. But that's what they're doing. They're going to sell this place out because they can afford it. We're going to talk about how come that's going to happen, because we've priced ourselves out of the market. You know, we can't even ship the goods out of Alaska to a U.S. port economically. Even though those ports are less than half the distance to China, it costs 1/10 the money to ship the same ton of ore to China as it does to ship it to a U.S. port, because of a piece of legislation called the Jones Act, which says shipping between U.S. ports must be done by U.S. flagged vessels, which means they're made in the USA. And shipbuilding in the USA is a very expensive proposition. As a consequence, most shipping from Alaska, a lot of it goes U.S. port, Canadian port, U.S. port. This allows you to use foreign flagged vessels. But if you're using a U.S. flagged vessel to get to a U.S. port, then you're going to pay 10 times the freight charge, because that's just the way the economy works, because of the Jones Act. And we don't have a railroad to give us the other option, which would be to railroad it, which is also a cheap form, to railroad it straight through Canada and on down into what is now the Rust Belt, where they could have at one point done something with that raw ore. We can still do that. It's not too late. The Canadians have aggressively moved their rail north. I've seen it. They're almost there because they're punching it to follow the resources north. We can fork off of that. We can bring it right into the rail system that exists in Alaska today and extend that rail system throughout Alaska like we did through the West. Through the other fifth of the country we've missed. Go look at a road map and a rail map. There's nothing here. This is the treasury of the nation. We're going to talk a lot about that, because the treasury of the nation is being looted again. And, you know, I'll give you a good example. British Petroleum, up until the mid-'80s, 25% of British Petroleum was owned by the British Crown. Right. The same people that colonized America all those years ago owned 25% of British Petroleum when they owned 50% of the oil coming off of the North Slope of Alaska. Were we still a colony? The British Crown thought so, because they were still collecting a lot, because they kept it up until the decline of the volume started going down. Then they sold it. Hey, we plucked this one clean for the best of the best. Now it's off of 2 million barrels a day plus. It's dropping fast. The price is dropping. Adios, Alaska. Your partners are gone. We've looted enough for now. But they've all done this. All of them have done this. And they continue to do this, and we invite them in as our partners when they're not. See, these oil resources that they've been working, they're our tenants, not partners. They are our tenants. They lease this from us. And there's good reasons why maybe we ought not to be doing that within the context of Alaska, and I can talk about that in this sense. 78 or 80% of the world's oil is produced now by national oil companies, like Denmark. You know, for instance, like when you look at what companies do with when they own their oil and they develop their own oil, like Norway and others, you develop a lot of wealth. And if you can retain that wealth, it can do a lot for your region. Now here in Alaska, we'll get to that. We did that. We retained it in a way that really is unusual. It gives us the potential to fund our entire government without any taxation of the people that live here. We're going to get into that a little bit, because this is an interesting model, Alaska, one that most people don't know much about, and we should know about it. This is our country, right? One of the forced forms of taxation in Alaska was a 3% fish tax back in the early days before statehood. And what was it for? For schools. Because again, as I said earlier, the first thing people organize is schools and sheriffs usually. And they pay for it out of their own money, and we were no different. So we said, how are we going to do this? And it was a fish tax. And I mentioned a little bit about the Morgan Trust and some of the Alaska mining history. One of the people that enlightened me on some of that history was a woman named Audrey Corey. And Audrey, when I met her, I was 14 and she was, I think, 68 or 70. And she had been a territorial nurse in Alaska when they used dog sleds to get around in the 20s, the 1920s. I got a vision of Alaska from her, because I used to go there, because she was also involved as a gemologist, involved in that trade, and her brother Tony taught me how to cut stones and how to do that, how to do lapidary work. And they're the ones who encouraged me to study gemology and to do all of that. But I got the best stories of Alaska. And when I later went to work for Chickaloon Village, she was related at the end to my adopted grandmother, right? I mean, it's weird how things circle back around. And she was a Caucasian woman, but she had all these experiences that were rich and deep, and they were all about people and relationships with very unusual people. The Jones Act I mentioned because that gets in the way. Now, my dad, in his first year in Congress, got an amendment to the Jones Act. Nobody thought that could happen. And that amendment allowed the Wickersham to sail here, which was a foreign flag vessel, and it allowed us to have passenger traffic in parts of our state that have no roads, and a ferry system, the Marine Highway we call it, which is in jeopardy now. We used to operate when we had no money. Now we can't seem to figure out how to operate it at all, and it's a mess. But it's a way that we can't even drive to our state capital, all right? They get to hide down there when they ought to be here where the population is. But again, it's Alaska. It's a little bit differently. But Alaska represents the balance sheet of the nation. You know, when we talk about national budgets, they always want to talk about cash in, cash out, the cash flow, the P&L statement, we call that in business. They never talk about the balance sheet, the wealth of the nation. Well, what is that? Well, that's how much everything is worth that we own in common, which is most of the nation, actually, when you think of public lands. We'll talk about that later because it wasn't supposed to be that way. The federal government, at least, wasn't supposed to have this much land, but they do. It's supposed to be states and individuals eventually that had land. And we'll talk about that when we talk about what's happened in terms of land and land rights. Here in Alaska, I'll give you the examples. 100% of the land, 1/5 of the nation. 1% of this state, representing 1/5 of the nation, is owned by private parties like you and me. 1%. 9% has been repatriated to the Native Americans that were here first with all the rights intact. That means you got 10%. The rest is state and federal land. That doesn't make any sense to me. That wasn't what was planned here. Now, most of that's federal land because what we did here was different than other states. When we had our Statehood Act, well, we were smart, we thought, and we said, we don't care about the surface of state. We want the wealth under the land, you know, oil, gas, minerals. So whatever the federal government gets under their land, we get 90%. That was our deal under statehood. We get 90% of all the rents and royalties under all federal land, and then whatever we can negotiate on our own land, the 104 million acres that we got to keep. And then there's 44 million acres that Native Americans got to keep. And then there's, you know, a little bit left over for everybody else. And then there's also the Mental Health Trust, which owned 1 million acres. And that's an interesting story. We'll get into that in a few minutes. And then we have the University Land Trust, which is about 250,000 acres, give or take a few. But land trusts, and they had the surface estate. That's what we all own when we buy property. And then they own the mineral estate, which doesn't go with property anymore. And then they own the energy estate and the subsurface rights and the water rights and all the rights that ran with the land in these major land grants. On my land in the middle of the Wrangell Mountains, it's 812 acres of patents. I have it all, water rights, mineral rights, surface estate, the whole thing with my partners. And we predate statehood. We predate everybody. 1904, signed by the President of the United States, those patents and land surveys. But now we don't get the same kind of things happening in all of this. For instance, when land is transferred, you don't get all those other rights. They're reserved to the state. The water rights go to the state. The underlying mineral rights are reserved separately. You got to claim those separately under certain rules and regulations. It used to be that anyone, 18 and over, an American citizen, could go out and make a discovery of valuable minerals on federal land, make a claim according to a set of rules, pay a few bucks for recording it, and poof, it was yours to go process and mine. And if you could prove by the prudent man test, which was that it was an economic adventure, you could gain a patent which gave you full title, like what I have on my land. And then you had the right to do something. And that's how mineral titles were transferred. And if you were a person and you wanted to go homestead some land until the early 1970s, the early not 1870s, 1970s, you could still homestead federal land in Alaska. Now in the 60s, you could still get up to 160 acres. By the 70s, they'd restricted it quite a bit. You get home sites of about, I think they were 5 acres, and you get commercial sites around 5 acres, but you could still make a homestead. And what did that mean? That meant you went out, you staked the corners, and then you improved the land for a certain number of years, and then it was yours. You got a title, a patent from the federal government, and you got to own it. And that's how land transferred for a few hundred years here in the country, and then stopped, and the federal government just started holding it all. And then they did some things in Alaska that are very different. And my dad was right in the middle of it. Now, Alaska, as a strategic location, of all the strategic minerals, there's over 30 of them. All of them are here in mineable quantities, except I think one. Not just little mines, big mineable quantities. Now, I'll give you an example. Zinc, common mineral used throughout the world. A lot of people don't know it, but 6% of the zinc concentrate in the world that's produced by mines every year, 6% comes from one mine in Alaska called Red Dog. That mine, the ore is so rich, the first body that they did was 18% zinc by weight. You could almost just pick it out of the ground and ship it to a smelter. But they didn't. They processed it to a certain point. The streams running through that area never held fish because the natural runoff just didn't allow for it. They couldn't live there. The water standards they have to meet, there's fish there now that were never there, okay? Because they got to meet a standard so high that they can live there. They built a port, a road, over $100 million spent of state money. All of it got paid back under state bonds that were issued to help them do that. They don't run all year long because the ocean freezes there. You know, the port's frozen solid. They can't ship in certain times of the year. But they still produce 6% of all the world's zinc. Now, north of there, believe it or not, north of there, is the biggest graphene deposit ever found anywhere. It'll produce 50,000 metric tons a year at a minimum, and that will provide all the graphite and graphene anticipated the U.S. would need to use if we converted to a battery economy or an electric economy, as an example, assuming that's the technology that eventually is used. Cobalt, copper, zinc, molybdenum, all the rare earths are available in mineable quantities here, and there's a number of mines being developed that are in all different states of development. And I stay involved in that at a pretty deep level, in oil and gas and minerals, knowing what's happening here. And I subscribe to a couple of journals. They're pretty pricey because they only have like 400 circulation because they're for mainly people in the industry, but I want to be informed. And it reports on everything in Alaska and northwestern Canada, so I know kind of my region, what's happening here, what's coming. And already what's coming is huge. There's one project, Donlin Creek. It'll happen, and it's a native-owned land, so the natives are going to benefit greatly. In fact, Red Dog, the native corporations get 25% of the net. And then because of the way the Native Land Claims Settlement Act was written that my dad wrote, 70% of that doesn't go to the one native group that has it there. 70% of that money from natural resources is spread amongst all of them because some were endowed with great resources and other native structures in Alaska weren't. So the way they balanced it is the local group got to keep 30%, but the rest is distributed among the regional corporations and the village corporations under sections of the Native Land Claims Settlement Act. Again, a way to create wealth and equity and a way to build wealth. this initial settlement that my dad got, all the industrialists and globalists wanted to settle for 20 million acres. And my dad went all over the place. He went to every village he could get into and told them, don't settle for less than 40. And then he got 44 million acres instead, and almost $1 billion in cash, which in 1971 and 72, that was a lot of money. Now think about that. He's a freshman congressman. There's only one for this whole state. He had to convince 434 of his colleagues, enough of them to vote for the biggest land claim settlement in the history of the United States. And he did it in his first year, along with a bunch of the other legislation I'd mentioned earlier. And he was effective and he was efficient. But he could outwork anyone because he could do what I'm doing, only he could do it probably longer. And just on Russia, he could do this for a couple of days. But he was very bright on all of that. He knew how to work with systems, but more importantly, he came from roots that were real. So he identified with everyone he met. They weren't just people suffering, they were people he knew were suffering because he'd suffered right like that himself. Not as cruelly as some of rural Alaska at the time because it was bad. I mean, tuberculosis was running rampant here then. I mean, come on, most of it was fixed everywhere else. You know, people were dying all over the place here. And what was it from, ultimately? And what is it from today? It's post-traumatic stress syndrome from interacting with a culture that never understood them. The Russians came here first, enslaved everybody, made them do this work or die, or their families die. They enslaved them, they treated them like animals. Anytime they moved inland, they burned their fort to the ground and sent their canoes back with their heads in them. You know, they didn't take a lot of this territory that they claimed because they never got a fort built. In Southeast, they burned them periodically. You know, but the Russians had tried to make a land, they'd been all the way to California establishing trading facilities. You know, they were all up and down the West Coast. They just couldn't hold it because the natives here wouldn't let them. They got the chain, the Aleutian chain, because of the way it was set up. But once they got in interior Alaska, it was a whole different ballgame here. And the Athabascan people and the others didn't let it happen too far, but eventually they were just overwhelmed. I mean, when the gold rush happened, it was all over. By then it was all over. Too many people, too much change. But with it came every kind of disease you can imagine. You know, the Spanish flu was 100 years ago. The worst place in the world for Spanish flu was Alaska. The village I worked in, Chickaloon Village, was 250 people at the beginning of the Spanish flu, and at the end of it, there were 5 sisters living that they grew back out of, another couple hundred, almost 300 probably now. But, you know, what happened was destruction. Tyonek, the other village that I'm affiliated with through adoption, how did that village form? Well, Chief Chickalooshan, where Chickaloon is named after, he went around this whole Cook Inlet region. There's 8 native villages, Athabascan villages that were here, and he went around and he collected all the orphan children from the Spanish flu, and he took them to Tyonek to get away from us and what we were doing. Every kind of disease, alcohol, even sugar was a disease, really, what it did to people. All of it, the clash of culture was horrible. And what did we do when we got here? We started taking all the kids away from their parents and moving into boarding schools. How would you feel at 5? Some stranger just jerking you out of everything you knew. How would you feel as a parent? Parents were hiding their kids. Can you think about that and then know that this isn't a past generation, hundreds of years ago? These are my friends right now. And when you look around and you see the impact in Alaska of what's happened for the clash of cultures, you don't have to look very hard to see it. And to see the impact of it, you just have to drive around my town for a few minutes. And Anchorage, I'm embarrassed about Anchorage. I used to be proud of the city and what it did, but I'm not anymore. I'm ashamed of what Anchorage has become under the kind of leadership that thinks tolerance is a way to meet people and fix problems. Because it's not. It's meeting them right where they are. figuring out what happened and then seeing what you can do about it. And what's happened largely in Alaska is all of our responsibility, and it's not someone dead from long ago, because I could complain about the Romans too, kicking in my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's door in Croatia. Or even more modern time, I could complain about the Serbs that butchered my cousin in the 90s on her front porch in Croatia. But I never even got to meet her. They live in the same place that my grandfather left over 114 years ago. I never got to meet her. I met family there that I didn't know I had, that live more free than most of us do, but they live poor. The household income there is $175 a month, but they live rich. They live in a rural place, they farm, they grow most of what they need, what little bit of hard cash they need. It's a lot like rural Alaska. A little bit of hard cash for the fuel to get to the meat, little fuel to keep the heat on in the winter. But other than that, it's really about what can you do on your own. And most of the world still lives this way. We've lost that in the West. We've become very dependent on everything else, which makes us weak in a lot of ways. Our independence is what always made us strong. And we've accepted an exchange, and I hope we get deep enough into this, and we will before we're done, because there's a way to reclaim a lot of this. What was different in Alaska was everybody here had the idea that we were going to build something. Let me tell you how my dad sat in the Senate, and I'm sorry for getting a little bit emotional, but I can't help it. It's just too important to just take lightly. You just can't do it. But my dad sat in the state Senate in Alaska in the early 60s, right after statehood. In front of him was a guy named C.R. Lewis, and C.R. Lewis was a John Bircher. For those who don't remember what John Birchers were, they were like the ultra-right of the day. And then on his other side was a guy named Tom Fink, who was Mr. Republican of the day. And then there was my dad, Mr. Democrat of the day, and in those days it was all about labor. And these guys on the floor of the Senate would fight like crazy. And then they'd all go to dinner at night, and they would continue the debate, and they cared about each other, and outside of that place they were always friends, because they were always fighting over a solution to make Alaska better. You know, and that's the way I grew up. I was always looking for the passion. You know, if I knew there was a lot of passion and it was about fixing something, I would get excited, because I thought that's all you needed, because that's what I saw. That's what worked. You didn't have to agree with the guy. You just had to know he had the same passion for a solution as you do, and you could go shape one with him. And that's the way we got things done in Alaska, because we could have this vigorous debate, but at the end we had to agree on something that was going to work, and not somebody from out of town telling them what they wanted for some other reason. We had to live here and make this work here, because there was no road out of town. One road out of town, literally. We get one slide just a little past here, and Steve running the camera, he can tell you where it is. Right when you drop down to Moose Creek. The next big earthquake, poof, no road for however long it takes to clear it. And a whole bunch of spaces like that all the way down the highway. The only other way in and out is by airplane, and when there's an earthquake, a big one, airports don't look so good to land on. And then you got ports, of course, and we've lost a few of those in our history too. The point of the matter is, this is a major part of the nation that's being ignored. It represents the biggest wealth in the nation. Just in oil and gas alone, we could pay the national debt. And hydrocarbons aren't going to be around forever. They're going to go away. We're going to get into that before this thing is over. Statehood and land. So they told us we were going to get 90% of all the rents and royalties, and hell, they decided to open up a little of the National Naval Petroleum Reserve. Now, when did we know it was a petroleum reserve? When we discovered oil leaking up on the surface of the ground and forming asphalt, more or less, for however many thousands of years that had been going on. So we thought, wow, this looks like a naval petroleum reserve, and that was way back before statehood. So we knew we were going to get it, and we knew sooner or later they were going to develop it, and we were going to get 90% of it, and the same with Anwar and every other area. And then we found out that the Statehood Act was as worthless as an 1880s Native American treaty. Right, because we went to the U.S. Supreme Court and argued this, and we lost. Because the U.S. Supreme Court said a Statehood Act can be changed arbitrarily by any future Congress. Whoa. In other words, they could do a deal on us anytime they wanted. Now here's the sad part about it. As the state of Alaska and as a territorial citizen who was violated by this entire Statehood Act, and here's why. Under a treaty in the United States Constitution, a treaty supersedes the Congress. That's why they require so much to get done, because they are like supersedes everything. So when you make treaties, they're supposed to bind like nothing else. But we broke them all with tribes over time, but then we quit doing those because they kind of come back to bite you. The Hawaiians had theirs revisited and did a little better deal over there. But when we look at what happened here, we didn't have a settlement. So they discover oil. You can't build a pipeline unless you know who owns the land under it, because bankers don't like financing things when you don't know the title's good. And they were talking about, at that time, the biggest private investment in history. And it was estimated to cost $1 billion, and they ran into a few cost overruns, and it cost $9 billion when they finished. Now, I mentioned I worked on that because it was a historic thing. I really wanted to be there. And as I think back on it, it was a cost-plus job. The more they spent, the more the companies made. What do you think happened? Well, it didn't cost $1 billion. You know, when you get 10% over cost, you're only going to get $100 million on that. Why not get $900 million instead? And that's what they did. So that was cool for them and bad for you and me, because that set the tariffs, the transportation costs of that oil. And then the oil companies own the corridor too. They own the pipeline. So they were getting the tariffs, and they're getting the oil, they're getting the gas, and Alaska got 12% of the whole thing, 12% in royalty, plus almost $948 million on the leases when they first leased them back in 1969, and they started flowing June 17th, 1977 is when the oil started actually flowing. I know because I left May 31st of that same year as I finished my last job on that project. 2 million barrels a day went through there. Now what happened in all this is we had a couple of really interesting governors, both of them Republican governors. Wally Hickel was one. He came a couple of different times, and he believed in the owner state, and he owned a bunch of hotels and property here, and he showed up with no money years ago in the 50s and made something of himself, and became governor a couple times. He always had big ideas, real creative guy. He used to make people nervous, you know, because he was like too creative for politicians. But I liked Wally Hickel because he always had a big vision for Alaska, and he believed we should be the owner state, that we owned all these resources. He called the commons, our oil and gas, our other things. And I shared that vision as I see it with him, as we're in the unique position. And so Governor Hammond, incredible visionary Republican governor, decided that a good idea would be to put 25% of all the money we were making from oil and gas into a fund that wouldn't be touched, would be built up like a big savings account. The only mistake is we should have put it all in, because if we had by now, all of our government costs would be paid out of that fund. It would cover the whole thing. But we got 25% in. Now what do we do with that? We gave everyone a vested interest in that in Alaska, because about the same time we wiped out the income tax. We didn't have a state property tax. We never had a state sales tax. So in Alaska, we have some local property taxes, and we have some local sales taxes in certain communities, and then we have federal taxes, but state, no, not for the average person here. You're not being taxed, because our tax is paid out of our commons, out of the things we own in common that we get rents and royalties from, except for the part the federal government screwed us out of. And that's just a shame, because under the UN treaty, which was a treaty that superseded that Constitution, had we just made a treaty arrangement, we would have been better off. But we even got screwed there, because if you remember all the colonies that British had and the French had and Belgium had all over the Pacific, see, they were all decolonized by votes. And the votes required, basically they had to have the right of voting for sovereignty too. Like in this case of Alaska Territory, we should have been given the option of remaining a territory, becoming a state, becoming a commonwealth, or becoming independent entirely. And we didn't get that vote. In fact, we didn't get anything like that vote. We got statehood, yes or no, and then all the military that were here were given bonuses. $5 bonus, doesn't seem like much money, but when you were only making $100 or $85 a month back then in the military in Anchorage, $5 was worth going to the poll. Now, why would the occupying force have a vote in anything here? And they did. There were 20,000 military posted here. They voted. A lot of people in villages didn't read or write English at that time. They didn't. Okay? Who decided statehood? Here. And no one had the option of not doing it. They were bringing Hawaii and Alaska in at the same time because Hawaii at the time was Republican, Alaska at the time was Democratic, and it wouldn't change the balance in the U.S. Senate. That was the theory. So they brought them both in at once. That's why 49 and 50 happened at basically the same time, because it was about balance in the Senate. Now they're talking about D.C. and Puerto Rico and other places for political reasons that aren't balanced, but this was the nature of things in the 50s. You did it differently. There was a little bit more honor and a little less tribalism in government. And that's really what I want to emphasize here too in Alaska. As different as we all were, we were building a state. We're still building a nation, folks. We're just further along, but we're not doing it. We're not participating in the way we are. We've been moved out of it to a great degree. I had mentioned government by endowment, because Norway did this with their oil fields. They have, I think, $500 billion in their permanent fund, enough to take care of their old people, to take care of education, to take care of a lot of things, because their natural resources have been converted to produce revenue streams that relieve the burden. These are one-time sources of revenue. When these minerals and oil and gas are gone, they're gone. So to put them into a frame where they continue to produce revenue, to operate the functions, the true functions of government, would make sense that we do that we're smart about that. Alaska now has somewhere around $70 billion in our permanent fund, and this session of the legislature has spent nearly $20 billion in other funding that was various pockets of money, and they've exhausted our state's revenues. If it wasn't for the federal COVID money and the temporary rise in oil, we would be in deep trouble here. And we are. Our oil revenues are way down. Our tourism is in the toilet. The other industries are suffering by virtue of the fact that everything is disrupted in the supply chain. And that's grossly unfortunate because Alaska is in fact a great hope for this nation as a protein producer with our oceans. The potential of agriculture here as weather and climate changes, because it's going to continue. It's not going to be stopped no matter how much you wish it would. It's not. It's going to change. We should be building for that change. You know, the Japanese have been doing it for 3 decades. They've been buying agricultural rights in Canada because they've lost the ability at the right elevations, the right temperature gradients to grow crops in the manner in which they wish to. So they started decades ago because it's obvious what's happening. So you can scream about it, or you can accept the fact that some of it you're not going to stop. You're going to have to adjust the way you work. Here in Alaska, we've developed some things. I talked about the mental health trust. That was pre-statehood. Now I'm going to tell you how a trust is misfunctioning. This is one of them. And I spent enough time, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but think about it, 1 million acres of land that you've had since the mid-50s. Okay, now 65 years. You'd think you'd have an inventory of that, know what it's worth. You know your trustees. They don't have a clue. I ask them for a balance sheet. They can't produce one. They can show you the cash portion that someone else is managing and all of that, But that's being managed by someone else. As trustees, they cannot give Alaskans a value for their own land that they hold in trust to solve the mental health problems of Alaska, which I can tell you are a dismal failure. I asked my conservative banker friend Dave Cuddy if I'd given you 1 million acres, including all the oil and gas and minerals and timber and everything that went with it, could you figure out how to make that work for mental health in Alaska? He started laughing. Of course, 65 years and that kind of a program to work with, this problem be solved. We haven't done anything. They don't even have an inventory of the assets. They say they're all for sale. I said, okay, where's the listing? Oh, they don't know. Now you're going to buy land in Alaska. You're sitting in Italy. You're a big industrialist. You think, man, I need about a 10,000 acre parcel. Wonder if any's for sale. Oh, let me call the Mental Health Trust in Alaska. They'll know. Give me a break. This isn't going to occur to anybody. You're going to call something that says real estate in the phone book. They don't have enough sense to get an inventory of what they have and make it for sale, although they say it's all for sale. And none of it's available. Here's how it's sold. You come in and you say, I'd like this piece of land. They go get the highest appraisal they can and say, that's the price. Okay, I guess that's one way to do it. But it's not a way to sell land, it's just a way to sell that piece of land. It's not a way to get more land into private hands so you can turn that into something else so you can deal with mental health. When you have your land for sale, either it is or it isn't, and you ought to find a way to do it. Bureaucrats don't really like that. They like to kind of maintain the program, not have anything controversial. No, don't rock the boat until at least we get through, 20 years and a gold watch, that'll do it. And that's what you're dealing with here. Real leadership looks at the assets. We'll talk about that asset later, because there were some ways that it could have been used to solve some big problems in Alaska. The University Trust, I don't need to explain, it's the same basic formula. They haven't made it work for them. They're always in deficit. The price of education keeps going up, and they don't recognize that in a place where no one can get anywhere, maybe we need to use the internet to educate people in Alaska. Wouldn't that be neat? We have the best telemedicine system in the world. We have T1 lines that can carry huge data feeds into every native village in Alaska to handle the medical care, and they got enough excess capacity to run an entire educational program in every village of this state with just a hookup. We're not even thinking about solutions because of a lack of leadership, because virtually all legislation is driven by lobbyists, not holistic thinking of a plan. That's why you should insist on people that want to lead in government. They actually have a plan that's not a slogan, that takes some time to articulate, because to have a plan, it takes time to explain a plan. And what we've been doing all day today is started that plan with you, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And now we're going to work our way through the commons of Alaska and then through the commons of our country and maybe see a different vision for ourselves. I want to talk about, I talked about telemedicine and rural health really quickly there. It's really a shame because it deserves a show of its own, and maybe one of these days we'll follow up. People come from all over the world to see what we're doing here because it works. In rural Alaska, it works. In the dentist industry, we weren't getting dental care, I mean, we got people with teeth rotting out of their heads, which leads to all kinds of illness in rural Alaska. One of the reasons people are dying in rural Alaska. And so the Dental Association showed up at the last care of this, because Senator Stevens at the time, the senator my brother Mark beat when he ran for the U.S. Senate, but at the time, he said no, and he was a powerful man. He said, no, sorry, American Dental Association, we're going to allow people to fill cavities without a dental license. We're going to do it with 2-year degrees. We're going to teach people how to clean teeth and how to fill fillings and do basic dental work with 2 years and 3-year degrees, not dental degrees and not your stamp of approval. And so they worked really hard. They got every university in America not to teach one of them. Not one. So we sent them all to New Zealand where they had the same program, and we made sure they got taught, because the native leaders of this state said, oh, you're not going to do this to us. And Ted Stevens said to them, you're not going to do that to them. And guess what? We have dental technicians all over Alaska doing the dental care that the American Dental Association stood in the way of for their own selfish interests as people died in our villages. And the American Medical Association does the same thing. They won't let you stratify medical care in the way that it ought to be stratified so that you can do more with lower level techs of lower level skill levels. Why aren't we doing more of that instead of less of that? We're protecting a class of power, not people, power, an industry that wants to stay, wants to keep, and wants to grow. Can you blame them? That's what they do. But they want to do it on the backs of our civil liberties and our freedoms and claim them as at their corporate property. Now, what happened in Germany was alliances between corporations and government. They called that fascism. I don't know what you call our version of that, but it's corporations and government and cooperation. We just don't like to associate it with that word fascism. So what do we call it here? I don't know. I call it corruption. Corporate corruption is what I call it. Other people call it fairness doctrine for the corporations. After all, they're people too. No, they're not. You have a finite life. Corporations live forever as long as you pay the fees. They don't die of old age. They don't breathe air. They shouldn't decide anything for someone that does, right? Unless they're equally liable and accountable, which means their boards and their officers get to go to jail when they screw up. When they create some disaster like Bhopal and kill 1,000 people. Who went to jail for that? Nobody. Mass murder, corporate excuse. Sorry, general liability insurance will cover it. That's where we're at, folks. Corporate liability insurance, tort reform. Let's save the corporations because after all, they run the government now. Want to keep the government going. Does that sound right? Not to me. But that's where we've gotten. Now let's think about rural health again. Remember when I talked about them netting all those rivers, blocking all those fish? A lot of them never came back. Then there were other reasons they did things. They diverted streams. We rehabilitated one in Chickaloon Village, put a stream back where it belonged, returned 26 miles of salmon spawning area, and introduced a technology that was brand new, but it really wasn't. It was micro hatcheries. And these are like small, they're the size of a Pepsi machine or a big refrigerator. And they can produce 600,000 eggs every year in about 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And this was not new. This was really old. This is Southeast Alaska Tlingit technology. The way the Tlingits did this, because they had they're very steep mountains, they had very short river lengths, very short spawning areas. So you didn't have much area. So they would collect up the eggs from the mating species, and they'd put them in baskets that had little holes. They were like loose baskets. And then what would happen is they'd put them by the waterfalls where the mist would keep them all moist. And then as the eggs formed, and then the fish formed within the egg, and the little fry hatched out of the egg, they drop through the hole of the basket and fall into the water. Well, why is that important? Well, the scavenger fish, like the trout and other species, they eat all those eggs when they get laid in those egg beds. And about 85% of them get eaten before any little fish pop out. So this assures more little fish will pop out, and less will get eaten, and more will escape, and more will come back. And it worked. So the same idea was put into this Pepsi machine was keep the water the same temperature, all right, mist the eggs to keep them moist, get them away from the predators into trays that you could look into, and then twice a day they check the temperature of the stream to match the temperature in this big machine. And then they're cleaning and filtering the water, and then anything gets infected or diseased, they can see it and they can get rid of those diseased eggs and keep everything clean. And then when the eye forms, when they're just about to hatch, they take them with a Venturi system in a backpack, and they literally put them into the beds deep enough, so they're deep enough where the scavenger fish can't get to them, and they plant the eggs in the bed. So instead of holding these eggs all year long and hatching fish and then trying to feed them and keep them alive, which is where all the diseases and the problems happen, now they have the genetic species from that stream being matched to that stream, being put back in that stream, and during the process of the egg growing, if they oscillate the temperature in just the right way, the bone inside the gill will create a barcode so they know which ones grew in that environment and which ones were natural. So when they come back, they can decide who was natural and who wasn't. They don't have to put tags and artificial stuff in them. So applying the best of technology and the best of knowledge and shortening it up to a 6 to 8 week period, depending on the species, they're able to get them back in, and 85% of the eggs come out instead of 15% naturally. So there you get an increase. Now, I took the lieutenant governor under Republican administration down to take a look at Chickaloon when he was a lieutenant governor, and we went down and looked things over for like 4 or 5 hours. I took them all over, a tour through their whole program. And then he attempted to get this funded so we could pilot this in a number of places. They piloted outside of the state in Nome, the only place fish came back that year, in Chickaloon, and then the one place in Southeast. These micro hatcheries are now being used throughout the West Coast as they re-permit the rivers and hydroelectric projects, being repurposed all over because they're very efficient. One of my friends who's in the legislature here in Juneau, I forgot I even mentioned it to him, and he called me the other night and said, "Hey, that bill's moving." And I said, "What bill?" And he goes, "On the fish hatcheries." And I went, "Oh yeah, I forgot I even talked to you about it." Because no one's paying me for this stuff. It's just a good idea. It had its time. I got hold of the guy who invented it. I said, "Hey man, what happened? Why didn't you get anything?" His legislator got unelected. So I talked to my friends. This is a good bill. It's moving. It's going to happen. They could do this on every major river system in Alaska, all 300 of them, and bring a fish stocks back by coordinating the biology with the state biologists so they do it right, training each community to do it right, and then allowing them to grow their own fish, grow their own food. That's agriculture in Alaska. USDA, we had to get them to modify the Farm Bill, something else I worked on. We got to get a modified legislation because they're dealing with 400 years of agriculture in the lower 48. It's not that here. It's about fish, it's about moose, it's about a different kind of agriculture that fits where we are and can do something different and can bring the food stocks up. Instead of fighting over the last fish, is what my chief used to say, how about making more fish? I think that's a great idea. One of the ideas I had 20 years ago, I just ran into the guy whose radio show it came out on, and it was on buying up the commercial permits when they become available and reallocating to subsistence users and to sports fishermen. Because right now they only get 3%. They're starving still in villages because they get 3%. All the rest goes to commercial fleets, mostly who are out of state, out of Alaska, that don't have a vested interest here. Every time a permit is foreclosed by the IRS, the state ought to buy it up and reallocate it to private users. Then you rebalance the deck. We can do that every time they become available. Don't let them be sold out of state anymore. Make them be sold here. Buy them back. Take the supply and demand factor out. These commercial boats, a lot of them are losing their butts. There's too many of them out there. If you do that, they will make money. There will be more fish. It's a supply and demand question. Again, allocation. Now I see in the paper 20 years later something's moving in that direction. Because when I did that radio show, the head of the Commercial Fishermen's Association at the time in that area calls up on the radio show, "That's a great idea. Why aren't we doing it?" I said, "Don't ask me. You're the fisherman." Well, it is happening now. It's 20 years later. Plant some seeds. Never know who hears what. And this is what all this is about today, is talking about ideas that work. A reallocation of the resources. Don't fight over the last fish. Find a way to make more fish. That's probably a better plan. There's no shortage of people. Rethinking shortage into abundance is part of the plan. Thinking about Alaska as a place not to exploit, but a place to rationally develop for a generation of the future that will make a difference.